Okay, so let's go ahead and get at it. Again, thanks for listening in today. You're probably at study hall right now, but you can certainly watch this over the weekend. So, I think the in-class exercise went very, very well on yesterday, on Wednesday. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to pick up with the right to privacy. We've got a little bit left on cruel and unusual punishment. We're going to save that for this coming Monday, largely because that was part of your in-class exercise. So we'll just go ahead and pick up there. We should be, without any trouble, be able to finish up what's here in outline 8, which of course is civil liberties, and then transition to outline 9 and talk about civil rights. So let's talk a little bit about the right to privacy, and we're going to break it down into a couple of different issues. Contraceptives, abortion, and talk about marriage rights, and then finish it up with criminal justice. Just a little bit of overlap there. Okay, and again, this is an area of law that I wish we had a lot more time. If this were a constitutional law course, we'd spend actually a few weeks on this area of law. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the right to privacy. Now, this is one of those rights that's actually not enumerated in the Constitution. So if I gave you a copy of the Constitution and I said, find the right to privacy, you're not going to find it. It's not there. This is one of these judicially created rights, very much akin to the exclusionary rule that we talked about last week. Of course, the exclusionary rule telling law enforcement essentially if you illegally obtained evidence, you can't use it against the criminal defendant at trial. And again, that was a rule that was developed in 1914. So the right to privacy, we're actually going to start here in 1965. So the Supreme Court between 1914 and 1965 had gotten a little bit of practice, if you will, in developing constitutional rights that might not be expressly written in the Constitution. Now, the debate as to whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing is really kind of beyond the scope of this course, but just know it's certainly a reality. So we go ahead and we start with Griswold versus Connecticut, and this is the first time the United States Supreme Court enumerated the right to privacy and said, you know what, it's here, maybe you can't find it in the Constitution, but we, the Supreme Court, will help you find it, okay? So essentially becoming a right that we've had for 53 years at this point, and one that, for the most part, we can't really imagine living without. However, that's not to say that we would all agree on the scope. Okay, so let's talk about Griswold versus Connecticut. All right, and this case actually dealt with the counseling on the use of contraceptives. Now, many states at this time, this just happened to be a criminal case in Connecticut, many states had an outright prohibition on the use of contraceptives. And again, in the year 2018, that's almost hard to imagine because we use contraceptives for so many different things, not just trying to protect against pregnancy, but also protect against sexually transmitted diseases. But again, it was just a little bit of a different time, as you might imagine. And the question was whether a counselor could actually be charged with a crime, all right, for counseling people on the use of contraceptives. All right, now it's a little bit interesting in the sense that this is one of these Supreme Court cases whereby we didn't actually have somebody charged with a crime. An interest group largely led by counselors and other people that believe in these kinds of rights, contraceptive freedom, challenged it almost immediately. Okay, so it's kind of one of these nice test cases where there was kind of like a no harm, no foul, but we wanted to see really where the Supreme Court, where this right really is and how the Supreme Court would define it. So what the Supreme Court said here is, number one, there is a right to privacy in the Constitution. Again, it's not specifically there, but we're going to help you find it. All right, and Justice Douglas wrote a very, very famous opinion where he took several parts of the United States Constitution, more narrowly the Bill of Rights, and said, you know what, if you look at these parts of the Bill of Rights, you're going to find the right to privacy. Okay? Now, he incorporated the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Ninth Amendment, and the 14th Amendment, packaged that together and said not only, right, is there a right to privacy, but this right to privacy should be recognized at the federal level as well as the state level. So one of the things you're going to want to get down in your notes is that this is one of those rights that has been incorporated to the states, right? Remember, we only have that very, very short list of rights that have not been incorporated to the states. Okay, so moving forward, what we get from Griswold is there is a right to privacy, right? We have several amendments that essentially make it up, but also that when it comes to reproductive capacity, right? And again, this case is just dealing with the counseling in regard to contraceptives. This is a private matter, right? This is something where, you think about the ultimate level of intimacy between two people. This is something that would be considered a right within the Constitution. Okay, now, moving forward about 7 years, we have Eisenstadt versus Baird. And this was a very similar case, also dealing with contraceptives, but also what professionals could do in terms of consulting people when they are married, right? Now, again, you look at your outline, they're both contraceptive cases. You can kind of imagine where we're headed with Eisenstadt versus Baird. The Supreme Court saying, again, there is a right to privacy. If people want to be counseled, right, they can when it comes to issues concerning contraception. But also, right, the counselors have a right to provide that information. So think about it. So it's really two ways, all right? Whether I'm married or not married, all right, by the way, Eisenstadt versus Baird covers both groups, all right, and more specific to the point, by the way, in Eisenstadt versus Baird, whether you could treat married people differently than men married, and the answer is no, you can't, right? That married, unmarried people in general have a right to receive that information, but also the counselors have a right to provide it, right? So it's really kind of two sides. But as you can imagine, there isn't really a huge jump between the 1965 case and the 1972 case. Now, where we do, however, see a big jump, and one of the reasons why Eisenstadt versus Baird is going to be found in any course, any introduction to political science course, American politics course, or any constitutional law course, it's because it's the year right before Roe versus Wade. Okay, so again, contraceptives in these first two cases considered a private matter, a private issue, right? The Supreme Court maps out a right to privacy. So the question becomes, can this be extended to abortion rights? Okay, so we fast forward to probably the most controversial Supreme Court case ever, and that's Roe versus Wade. Now, we have looked at other Supreme Court cases where you could certainly make the argument that they were travesties, and we looked at the Dred Scott decision, the Korematsu decision, maybe controversial, but I don't think anybody could imagine going back to that point in time. What makes Roe versus Wade a lot more controversial is that this is a case that keeps popping up, not only in legislative elections, presidential elections, elections at the state level, by the way, when it comes to legislative races, but also people running for governor, president, etc. at the federal level, but also every time we have an open seat on the United States Supreme Court, this becomes an issue. And again, recently we just completed the confirmation hearings in regard to now Justice Kavanaugh, and this was an issue again. All right. So the question becomes, really, does the right to privacy cover a woman's right to choose as to whether to terminate her pregnancy or not? Okay. Now, in 1973, again, this clearly was a landmark decision. It changed everything almost overnight, right? 49 states at the time, out of 50, had laws criminalizing abortion. Now, admittedly, at different levels, so that is beyond the scope of this course. But essentially, all 49 states criminalized it at some level, all right? And the question becomes, right, whether this right to privacy covers a woman's right to choose whether to terminate her pregnancy or not. Okay, now, with that said, one of the more interesting issues, aside of the actual functional issue, I should say, of abortion, was really a standing issue. Now, Jane Roe, as her pseudonym was, basically to protect her anonymity as she went through the process. Norma McCorvey was her actual real name. She had actually had to go through the entire birthing process, and again, the human gestation period is still 9 months, one way or the other. So whether the Supreme Court's going to act quickly or not, it really doesn't matter. You've got 9 months, right? Okay, so the question became, all right, can you actually have a litigant who has standing, right, the ability to bring a case forward even if she is not pregnant, right? And the Supreme Court said, okay, yes, right, there is standing here. We realize that this is an issue that's going to come up time and time and time again, that women in this country will continue to get pregnant just like around the world, right? There is a biological issue there. And the Supreme Court just can't say, okay, wait a minute, we've only got 9 months to decide this particular case. So they did address the standing issue. Okay, now, as you probably well know, Roe versus Wade does give women the right to choose to terminate their pregnancies. Okay, now, what constitutional right gives women the ability to do that? And the Supreme Court said the right to privacy. Now, legally, if you're thinking, well, my gosh, we've made a huge jump, in the sense that there is no right to privacy enumerated, specifically written in the Constitution, right? And we developed it in 1965 based on use of contraceptives, and now, of course, to pregnancy. It is a little bit of a legal jump in that respect, okay? And again, that's not me commenting one way or the other as to whether I think it's right or not. But again, this is not uncommon with a lot of the civil rights and civil liberties we have today, which again might not be specifically written in the Constitution, but we couldn't imagine living without, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the framework. So you already know there is a right to privacy in the Constitution. It does protect a woman's right to choose to terminate her pregnancy. Okay, with that said, all right, the states, of course, that were trying to defend, the 49 states that were trying to defend their abortion laws, made the argument that there is a compelling interest, right, in protecting the life of the unborn. So the Supreme Court had to scratch this. Okay, now wait a minute. We got to find a way to make this work. Okay, we have to find a way to make this work. Okay, now by the way, Supreme Court's all men at this time. All right. Okay, so the question becomes, how do we protect a woman's constitutional right to choose to terminate her pregnancy early, and a state's right? How do we balance this with a state's right, to protect the unborn, right? Again, it doesn't matter what your political stance is. Supreme Court's got to wrestle with this, okay? And what they did is they came up with a trimester system, a trimester framework, if you will, all right? Where, again, the human gestation period being 9 months, if you think about the first 3 months, the first trimester, the Supreme Court said a woman's right to choose is almost unlimited, right? That when it comes to those first 3 months, the ability to terminate a pregnancy early, completely with the pregnant woman, almost no restrictions whatsoever. Okay, but in the second trimester, a state's interest gets a little bit more significant, right? So in months 4, 5, and 6, if you will, all right, those months become a little bit more critical, and the state can impose some limitations to protect those interests, right? Now, the interest, by the way, is not the fetus, the unborn baby, whatever phrase you want to use. The interest really becomes safety of the mother, okay? Now, what we knew then, and what we know today, by the way, is that for the most part, the earlier in the pregnancy, the safer to have the abortion. Okay, so again, with things shifting a little bit. So the Supreme Court said, okay, in months 4, 5, and 6, the second trimester, states have a little bit more of an interest in protecting the life of the mother, protecting the health of the mother, and maybe will allow for some safety restrictions. Okay, now that's going to pop up again in some other cases we're going to look at in a second, so kind of put that in the back burner for a second. Okay, now in the third trimester, all right, this is where the Supreme Court probably wrestled, in my opinion, if you read the decision, they had to wrestle the most. So the question became, can states actually prohibit abortions in months 7, 8, and 9? And the answer is possibly, all right, with some restrictions in the sense that, when it comes to protecting the mother as well, right? But the state's interest in protecting the unborn child, fetus, again, staying out of the politics, the heated politics of that issue, right? You can use either phrase, becomes much more significant. Okay, so it's 1973. We have the constitutional right. It's part of the right to privacy. We move on. And the issue, certainly in terms of its controversy, did not go away. Okay, now, one thing to point out as we move forward, remember what the Supreme Court is doing. The Supreme Court is striking down state law. There was no federal rule on any of this. Okay, now, I would say this, again, we've got a limited amount of time, and I've actually spent quite a bit of time looking at just the first 3 cases, but there are a lot of decisions, or there were a lot of decisions that came from the United States Supreme Court in the 1970s, 80s, and even through the 90s, whereby this was an issue that kept popping up, and you see really all of it's state law, right? Challenges based on state law with one chief exception. Okay, so let's look at Webster versus reproductive health. Now, for state legislators as well as state legislatures, right, putting all the legislators together, not maybe happy with Roe versus Wade. It could have been a political issue for them in terms of, hey, you know, this is what I need to say to get elected. Could be an issue that they had internalized, saying, you know, I think Roe versus Wade versus wrong. But they knew what the framework is, so they had to find ways, or tried to find ways, to kind of limit the impact. So, Webster versus reproductive health, here we had a state that really tried to put some significant restrictions on the type of facility, right, that an abortion could be held in. And essentially what you see here is a state prohibiting the use of public money, public facilities, and public personnel, right? Government facilities, government money, government personnel, right? When performing abortions, okay? So basically saying, well, yes, pregnant woman, you have the right to choose to terminate your pregnancy, but no state money, no public facility, and no public employees can be involved, okay? Now, you might say, well, maybe that makes sense politically in the sense that, well, taxpayers aren't, you know, choosing to fund something that they don't want to fund, like helping a woman choose to terminate her pregnancy earlier. Now, the flip side, of course, is that we pay taxes for a lot of things we don't necessarily support, okay? Now, with that said, the other way to look at it is here's a state trying to reduce the number of abortions by reducing access because of no public facilities, no public employees, and no public money could actually be used. Now, the Supreme Court upheld the ban, right? This is a Missouri case, upheld Missouri's ban on, all right, the use of public money, public facilities, and public employees for a woman wishing to terminate her pregnancy early. So, okay, so if you think about it, to a certain degree, it narrows the scope. Now, that takes us to Planned Parenthood versus Casey, a 1992 decision, just 3 years later. And many scholars, legal scholars, political scientists, what have you, would say that Casey really did overturn Roe versus Wade, at least in part, in the sense that it did away with the trimester framework. Okay? Now, there are actually lots of issues in Casey, but we're really only going to focus on 2. Now, the Supreme, or I should say, 2 restrictive rules that popped up. All right, there are two restrictive rules, and this is a Pennsylvania case. All right, one, there should be a 24-hour waiting period before a woman could terminate her pregnancy. So, in the sense, a woman would go in and see the practicing physician, whoever would perform the abortion, and that provider would say, okay, you have to wait 24 hours before we do this. Now, the impact, of course, there's 2 ways to look at it. One, a woman should really think this through, or number 2, a woman should really think this through and maybe think her way out of it, all right? In the sense that, well, if you wanted to reduce the number of abortions, forcing a woman to really think this through, one side or the other. Again, we're staying out of whether we're judging this or not, all right? Well, if it took the woman who wanted to terminate her pregnancy early enough guts to get it the first time, maybe she wouldn't do it again. That maybe it was so overwhelming for her the first time, she wouldn't do that again. Now, that's just one way of looking at it. The other is that, yeah, maybe she needs to really think this through. All right? This is a life-altering decision one way or the other. Okay? Now, the second issue, that at least we're going to wrestle with, there was a lot in the Pennsylvania statute, was the spousal notification rule. All right? So the idea is if a woman was pregnant, wanted to terminate her pregnancy, but she was married, she would actually have to notify her husband. Now, it was not a rule where the husband had to give consent or permission, right? Or it had to be a joint decision or something like that. It was really just a notification decision. Now, there are, again, two ways to look at this. If you're the husband, well, yeah, this is something you would want to know. And marriage is supposed to be a contract where everybody's kind of together on these type of very intimate decisions, right? Kind of going back to the 1965 decision where the Supreme Court created the right to privacy because they thought this was kind of an intimate issue. The other way is, of course, is if a woman was pregnant, didn't want to stay pregnant, if you're trying to reduce the scope of abortion, well then maybe this isn't, if you tell your husband, maybe there's peer pressure, or perhaps worse, and if you had to tell that person, you wouldn't do it, right? Again, we're staying out of judgment. Those are just the arguments. Okay, now what the Supreme Court did functionally, let's get to the functional parts, and then we'll get to kind of the broader scope. Functionally, they did uphold the 24-hour waiting period. Many states today have 24-hour waiting periods today. They've been upheld as constitutional. The spousal notification rule, however, was found to be unconstitutional. All right, so a married woman does not have to notify her spouse. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, of course, with same-sex marriage being the law of the land right now, you would wonder if that, again, we'll talk about the scope of marital rights and privacy here in a little bit, but whether that would become an issue, especially with a changing Supreme Court. I mean, how would these rules play out? We'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. Okay, now, in the end, the trimester system was taken out, so there's no first semester, second semester, third semester, all right? But instead what the Supreme, this is a broader view, instead the Supreme Court said, well, a state just can't impose undue burdens on a woman's right to choose to terminate her pregnancy. Now, what that means functionally is that there's a lot more wiggle room, right? A lot more legal wiggle room, if you will. What's an undue burden? And really every case since 1992, every abortion case, the issue has really been, what is an undue burden? Is this an undue burden? Is it not? Instead of getting out of the trimester, or instead of using and therefore getting out of the trimester framework. Now, it's not to say that all states basically got out of the trimester framework. All right, the Supreme Court is saying, hey, you just don't have to use it. Some states, they've stuck with it. They've said, okay, we'll still use that, all right? Because it is functionally, when you think about managing your legal system, it's a little bit easier to do so. Okay, now the next two cases are admittedly very, very controversial, but also confusing, okay? And I was routinely teaching constitutional law when these cases were decided, and admittedly, I had a lot of students who were like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, how is this possible? Okay, so if you get confused and a little frustrated on these things, it's okay. All right, now, partial birth abortion is the topic of these next two cases, all right, the Carhart duo, if you will, and they deal with a very, very controversial method of abortion, kind of beyond the scope of this class. But if you want to read about it, you should. Okay, but when you read descriptions of it, it does seem a little unsettling. Okay, now to a lot of people that oppose abortion rights, they say, well, this is too unsettling, it's too drastic, it's too draconian, it's too physical, if you will. All right, again, I'm deliberately avoiding some of this stuff so you can look at it on your own. But with that said, all right, there was a state ban on this procedure and also a federal ban. Now, the Stenberg case deals more narrowly with the state prohibitions, and many states have done this and saying, you know what, okay, fine, a woman has a right to choose to terminate her pregnancy early, but she doesn't have the right to this type of method. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of doctors were saying, no, wait a minute, if this is the best form of abortion, method of abortion for my client, my patient, all right, the mother, then I should, you shouldn't be legislating medicine. Let me use the tools that I have, all right? Okay, now, the Gonzalez case, all right, the Carhart duo, but the Gonzalez case 7 years later dealt with a federal ban. Virtually the same law, again, both dilation and extraction cases. DNX are sometimes called D&E, and admittedly there's a little bit of a difference between DNX and D&E, but I'll look at that stuff on your own. Okay, but in the 2000 case, the Supreme Court struck down state bans on partial birth abortion. But in 2007, actually upheld a federal ban on partial birth abortion. So if you're scratching your head and saying, no, wait a minute, what is the law? Well, the law is, for the most part, right now, all right, but we really don't know. Okay, you could make the argument that D&E, right, dilation and extraction, DNX, these methods they're legal if a state wants to allow it, right? Now, the federal ban was a little bit more at the macro level. Again, there are some exceptions. Again, if it's the mother's life that's absolutely in danger, physicians are able to still use that method. But again, you're really overcoming quite a bit. Now, in both bans, actually, doctors would be charged with the offense. It's kind of an interesting reality. Okay, so again, if you're confused, that's fine, because the law on that issue is actually confusing right now. Okay, what I want to do is actually add a case to our list. I should have had it on your outline. All right, but I'm going to go ahead and put it on the board here. Whole woman's health, and I'll try to stay in the camera, all right, versus Hellerstadt. All right, and this is a very recent case, it's a couple of years old, about 10.5 years old. Okay, now this was also a case that, again, you would put it right along the lines of Casey and a Webster, all right, whereby states tried to narrow the scope, all right, of allowable abortion practice. Now, in this particular case, there are really two concerns, two restrictions. All right, the one dealing with a practitioner's admissions rights, that they had to have any physician performing an abortion procedure would actually have to have admitting rights to a hospital within 30 miles. Now, in some rural areas, that just was not going to be possible, right? That I could be a doctor and licensed and board certified and all that thing, but if I didn't have admitting rights to a hospital that was within 30 miles of where I am, all right, well then I couldn't perform the abortion, or at least the abortion couldn't be performed wherever I was at that time and wherever my patient was. So if I'm 45 miles away from the hospital with which I have admitting rights, you know, it just couldn't be done. It would be illegal, and it would be illegal on my part, right? As the doctor, I would be charged with the offense. Now, with that said, there are some rural areas where that's just going to be reality, right? It's not a lack of board-certified physicians. It's a lack of hospitals. And the second is really the restrictions they put on the type of facility whereby an abortion could be conducted. So, in other words, the state of Texas actually required that any abortion facility or any place where an abortion would take place had to look pretty much like a hospital. Now, if you think about it, you put those two together, the doctor, right, the physician had to have admitting rights within 30 miles, and these clinics had to be dressed up just like a hospital. That reduces the number of places and geographic areas where an abortion can take place. Now, again, one side of the argument, kind of what you would imagine, well, this is one backdoor way to limit the scope, right, of abortion. That is to say, it's harder to have abortion, so you just won't have as many. The other side of the argument is, well, of course you would want a physician with admitting rights within a half hour's drive to a hospital in case something bad happens, in some case the procedure goes wrong. And also the facility looks almost like a hospital and has the same type of care capacity in case something really goes bad. So again, two sides of the argument. We're staying out of the politics there for a second, all right? However, the Supreme Court actually struck down the Texas law, saying it was too much of, here comes the phrase, an undue burden. Remember, it's the undue burden standard that came out of Casey and what we've been wrestling with ever since, at least in regard to this area of law. Okay, so what I like about abortion case law, Again, it's a very controversial issue. We're not going to be able to avoid it completely, but it's a good way to kind of get into the mindset of the United States Supreme Court when they're creating, right, close calls, right? So again, looking at how law has evolved, right, and looking at close calls and looking at things on a case-by-case basis. When the standard moved from the trimester system to let's just call it the Casey system and the undue burden concern, now it's really on a case-by-case basis. What is allowed, what is not. Now, if we back up just a little bit and look at the Carhart duo, right, Stenberg and Gonzalez, there were changes on the court. I mean, and this had an impact, right? There were changes on the court. Maybe that's the best way to explain how a state ban on D&E and DNX was not, the state ban wasn't constitutional, but the federal ban was, okay? Again, it's very personal, it's very controversial, okay? But that right to privacy is now based on whether you have you as the state are putting into place an undue burden on a woman's right to choose to terminate her pregnancy. And again, the Hellerstedt case, whole woman's health versus Hellerstedt. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and look at another issue in regard to the right to privacy, and that's sexual activity. Now, this is a situation where we have two cases where the Supreme Court did something it rarely ever does, and that's change precedent. Now, if you remember, we've looked at really only two other sets of these types of cases. We looked at Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board, which we're actually going to spend a little bit more time with here in a second. At least I think we'll get to it today. We'll see how we're doing on time. But we looked at it a little bit earlier, but now we're going to look at it some more in the next chapter. We looked at the difference between Minersville versus Gobitis, and of course West Virginia versus Barnett on the Pledge of Allegiance and flag salutation. Okay, so this is very, very similar. So in Bowers versus Hardwick, the question became whether a state could criminalize sexual activity between people of the same sex, right? Now, this is a privacy issue, a right to privacy issue, and just as you can imagine, this is activity that takes place in private, okay? So the question becomes, right, how do you monitor this type of behavior? How would you know that it took place anyway, unless you're just watching certain types of people that you think would engage in this type of activity? Okay. Now, many states for years and years and years had actually criminalized sodomy. Most of those laws, of course, have been taken off the books, either voluntarily or they've led to criminal cases whereby the statutes have been found to be unconstitutional.